The first entry on this list of greats from 1998 is, in itself, a game of many firsts. Baldur's Gate was the first role-playing game, and only second ever game after the mech battler Shattered Steel, to come from now famed RPG developers Bioware. Founded in 1995 by two Canadian medical doctors, Ray Muzyka and Greg Zeschuk, Bioware's early days as a game studio were highly unusual. The two good doctors started with practically zero experience making games, as did nearly all of the 60 new recruits that came to work on what would become Baldur's Gate, making it very much a step into the unknown for the entire team. It was also the first big game to make use of publisher Interplay's newly acquired Dungeons&Dragons license, which to the inexperienced designers at Bioware was like a godsend. They had been big fans of tabletop games, and Dungeons and Dragons in particular, as had many higher-ups at Interplay, so the project naturally carried with it a great amount of excitement. What Bioware ended up making pushed the boundaries of computer RPGs, and was simply an extraordinary achievement considering its team of rookie developers. Using their proprietary Infinity engine, which was being built in tandem with the game itself, Bioware created a sprawling fantasy world, full of interesting characters inhabiting vibrant towns and cities, with huge stretches of perilous wilderness in between. While it was the first game made using this new engine, visually Baldur's Gate looked quite similar to two other groundbreaking RPGs from the year before, Blizzard's Diablo and Interplay's own Fallout. Like them, Baldur's Gate adopted an isometric top-down view, a visual style which had certainly been seen in games like Ultima before then, but reached a new bar of quality in games like Diablo and Fallout. Baldur's Gate not only matched the visual fidelity of those games, but arguably even bettered them, creating a beautiful, sometimes haunting world of lush green forests, winding coastlines, and perilous caves, displaying greater variety than the multi-leveled procedural dungeon in Diablo or Fallout's bleak, irradiated desert. From isolated rural farmsteads to the grand architecture and bustling streets of its titular city, Baldur's Gate's world is one of intricate details layered on grandiose settings, conveyed on a scale seldom ever seen in games before it. Even some of the devs were taken aback by its size, as designer Dean Anderson recalls. I remember when we plotted out the total world map with dungeons and interiors, I realized the game was over 10 times the size of one of my all-time favorite games, Legend of Zelda. My mind literally imploded. While he may be using the word literally slightly liberally in this case, Anderson's reaction at the time is totally understandable. According to Ray Muzyka and Zeschuk's approximations, dividing the game world by the default screen size across which players travel, its total area adds up to around 100 times 100, or 10,000 screens. This was a role-playing game of immense size for 1998, with around 100 hours of content spread across its world, depending on how many side quests and optional interactions players chose to engage with. This of course meant an immense amount of work for the writing staff, who wrote close to 1 million words of dialogue, though thankfully for the sanity of all involved, only a small percentage of that dialogue was voice acted.
Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me?
Still, no wonder the original release of Baldur's Gate came on 5 packed CD-ROMs. But quantity means little in a game that doesn't play well though, and Bioware certainly didn't rest on their laurels on that front either. Superficially, Baldur's Gate may bear a strong resemblance to Fallout and Diablo, but in terms of gameplay, it was very different. Blizzard's action RPG dungeon crawler was by far the most accessible of the three, with its immediate click-to-kill gameplay and addictive loot grind appealing to a larger audience. The two Interplay titles, on the other hand, were more interested in creating large, complex worlds to explore, with deep and customizable systems of character building, fueled by battle systems with a slower, more deliberate pace than Diablo. In Fallout, that led to a turn-based system using action points, while in Baldur's Gate it meant the wholesale recreation of the advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set, with its dice rolls, saving throws and all, in a virtual space. Battles played out in a sort of hybrid system which effectively seemed to run in real time, with party members fighting automatically until given new commands, but could also be paused mid-fight to allow for strategizing without the stress of time constraints. While this may seem like an odd choice in retrospect, a sort of halfway house between real-time and turn-based combat, it meant they didn't risk alienating gamers who preferred either style. It also allowed newcomers to learn the intricacies of D&D combat at their own pace, as even veteran players could have their hands full juggling the actions of 6 different playable characters in real time. But Bioware's commitment to the Dungeons & Dragons experience wasn't limited to driving the cogs and gears of the combat system. Starting a new game, players create and name their character, choosing their gender, appearance and race, as well as class, weapon proficiencies and more, much like they would on a D&D character sheet. Finally, the player assigns its character an alignment, a sort of moral compass which reveals their core character traits. The 9 alignments in Baldur's Gate are divided along 2 axes, with lawful, neutral, and chaotic versions of good, neutral, and evil. You could choose to position yourself anywhere on this moral map, from a lawful good paragon of virtue to a chaotic evil never-do-well. Depending on the relative alignments of your main character and the other major characters you meet on your quest, the interactions between them may be very different. Pitting together 2 very misaligned characters may cause friction between them, or even result in them leaving the group. It was these sorts of character interactions and emerging dynamics between party members that set Baldur's Gate apart from other deep RPGs like Fallout, which had its own vast game world filled with interesting storylines and choices, but was first and foremost always viewed from the perspective of a single playable character. Letting players recruit a team of up to 6 characters to travel and battle alongside the protagonist allowed them to have an approximation of the D&D experience on their home computer, without having to gather 4 or 5 friends around the living room table every time. As Anderson puts it, "I think it really comes down to the characters, story, and the ability to interact with it. There had been many epic fantasy games before, but we set out to create something closer to a tabletop experience, and the nuances you get from interacting with other narratives, and an evolving story." At this point, I think it's safe to say that they more than accomplished their goal. Baldur's Gate sold over 1 million copies in its first year, and eventually reached 2 million by the early 2000s, a huge number at the time for a fairly niche genre like computer RPGs. Critically, it was very well received, winning IGN's PC Game of the Year despite some stiff competition, and many Game of the Year or RPG of the Year awards at other publications. Riding this wave of success, Bioware soon began work on Baldur's Gate 2, Shadows of Amn. Now that the Infinity Engine was finished, they could simply create more and better content, resulting in a game around twice the size of the already huge original, lasting well over 200 hours in total. It also added to character depth and interactions, and introduced romance options with your companions, something which has ever since been a staple of Bioware RPGs. The general consensus around Baldur's Gate 2 is that it built on the first one and improved upon it in almost every way, and it frequently ranks high on best RPGs of all time lists, such as IGN's, where it sits at number 3 out of 100. But while a sequel may ultimately be considered the better game of the two, there's no doubt that Baldur's Gate 1 is the more influential, if purely by virtue of coming first. There had been other D&D games before it, but none had managed to simulate the pen and paper experience in such detail before, with such a rich world and sprawling storyline. In many ways, it led the charge for a new era of role-playing on PC, along with Fallout, and became a kind of template for fantasy RPGs well into the next decade. Interplay used its Infinity Engine to power the equally beloved Planescape Torment in 1999, as well as the more combat-heavy Icewind Dale games. The mid-2000s then saw a decline in isometric RPGs that lasted about a decade, until the genre was literally kickstarted back to life. Thanks in part to games like Pillars of Eternity, its 2012 Kickstarter campaign reached over $1 million in the first 24 hours, proving the insatiable appetite fans of classic RPGs such as Baldur's Gate had for those games, despite their old-school presentation. But perhaps the most obvious influence Baldur's Gate has had on gaming is in establishing Bioware as one of the most, if not the most respected creators of Western role-playing games in the 21st century. In the wake of their great success with Baldur's Gates 1 and 2, they made Neverwinter Nights in 2002, the first RPG powered by their new Aurora engine. Taking its name from a 1991 game which by many is considered the first true graphical MMO, this new Neverwinter Nights also placed great emphasis on multiplayer, and even let players create their own custom campaigns using the Aurora engine. After that came Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, a game by many considered one of the best licensed Star Wars games, and a fantastic RPG in its own right, with one of the more memorable twists in gaming history. But since then, Bioware's legacy has mainly been defined by two very different, yet also similar series, Dragon Age and Mass Effect. One is an epic fantasy RPG, which you could say is a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate, but without the D&D license to build on, while the other is a sci-fi RPG that lets you live out your deepest Trekkie desires. Yet both continued Baldur's Gate tradition of epic tales that unfold over multiple games, letting you save your custom characters and whatever choices they make throughout the story, to carry that progress forward into each new installment. Above all, they both exemplify the core values of great storytelling, interesting characters, and meaningful player choices that define every Bioware classic. Unfortunately, since the mainline finales of both series, Mass Effect 3 and Dragon Age Inquisition, Bioware's extended Golden Age appears to have come to a close, or at least a temporary slump. Their two latest games, Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem, were disappointing to say the least, considering the high bar the company had set by that point. with the latter even undergoing a total rehaul in an effort to salvage it. Hopefully, Bioware can soon get over this bump in the road, but even if they can't, no one can deny their immense contribution to role-playing games over the past few decades. In a more roundabout way, Baldur's Gate might also be the reason CD Projekt Red, the Polish studio behind the Witcher series, exists as a developer today. Marcin Nowinski, founder of CD Projekt, decided he would become the first to localize games into Polish back in the 90s, when conventional game distribution wasn't really a thing in Poland, much less game development. Starting with a very simple game, an Ace Ventura movie tie-in for kids that sold a few thousand units, he soon set his sights on much bigger fish, and secured a deal with Interplay to localize and publish Baldur's Gate for the Polish audience. Their initial stock of 3,000 units sold much faster than Nowinski and his colleagues expected, as eager Polish gamers snatched up 50,000 copies within the year, and effectively legitimized the small company in the process. After this great success, they struck a deal with Interplay to port the PS2 game Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance to PC. But this project soon got cancelled due to troubles at Interplay. The seeds of game development were already sown, however, so CD Projekt Red went looking elsewhere for ideas to make their first in-house game, and found them in the Witcher series of fantasy novels by Andrzej Sapkowski. And the rest, as they say, is history. For more on the intriguing genesis of CD Projekt Red, I highly recommend NoClip's 6-part video series on the making of Witcher 3, the first part of which goes into way more detail on the founding of the studio. Last but not least, another European RPG developer, this time from Belgium, also took heavy inspiration from Baldur's Gate and other CRPGs of the late 90s. Larian Studios, headed by Sven Vinke, was founded in 1996 and licensed Dark Eye, a German fantasy property not unlike Dungeons & Dragons, to use for their first role-playing game, the brilliantly named Divine Divinity. Unfortunately, it was a bit of a mess at launch, riddled with bugs as the publisher decided to rush it out of the door in an unfinished state. Some of the developers working on it didn't even know the game had released until after the fact. Larian's sequels to the first Divinity went through similar struggles, as they fought pressure from publishers to get games out by a certain deadline. Eventually though, the studio managed to achieve independence, thanks to a combination of Kickstarter backing and other investors, and created their first self-published game, Divinity Original Sin, in 2014. Finally, they could make an RPG without any outside pressure, and it really showed. The game was a great success and heralded as a return to form for isometric RPGs, winning PC Game of the Year at GameSpot. 3 years later, the sequel was released to even greater praise, and even managed to penetrate the top 20 best PC games of all time on Metacritic, where it has settled on a score of 93. The great critical and commercial reception of their original Sin games proved Larian's credentials, and soon their talents were noticed not only by fans and critics, but by Wizards of the Coast as well, the licensed holders of Dungeons & Dragons, and by extension, Baldur's Gate. They were so impressed by Larian's work that they decided to honor them with that most cherished of role-playing properties. So now, more than 20 years after they started making games influenced by the first Baldur's Gate, the student has taken over the work of the master, as Larian's Baldur's Gate 3 promises to be the next true sequel in a series which had lain dormant since the turn of the century. With such a wide-ranging influence on the landscape of PC RPGs, and its role in establishing Bioware as a powerhouse studio, Baldur's Gate has had more of an impact than just about any other Western RPG I can think of. It may not have as much name recognition as other influential 90s games like Doom, Warcraft, or Street Fighter II, but even so, I think the impact it had on its own genre was just as great. Like those games, it didn't necessarily invent the genre it belonged to, as CRPGs had certainly existed before, but it did, however, become a genre-defining title by which similar games would be judged afterwards. In terms of raising the bar for high-fantasy Western RPGs, and successfully transmuting the D&D experience into the digital realm, Baldur's Gate did more than any other. It became a prototype of sorts for many CRPGs after it, and not just those that utilized its Infinity engine, establishing norms around both visuals and gameplay that have actually become fashionable again in recent years. Perhaps due to nostalgia, or maybe just because its template still works so well even today. For all of those reasons, I think its influence definitely deserves the highest rating I have to give.